In the bitter winter of 1864, construction foreman Samuel Hayes discovered something that would haunt him for the rest of his days. 34 railroad workers had simply vanished without a trace during a single night shift between the Kansas prairie stations of Millfield and Cedar Ridge. Their tools lay scattered where they had dropped them, their lanterns still burning in the pre-dawn darkness, but the men themselves had disappeared as completely as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The official Union Pacific report buried the incident so deeply that it took over 150 years for the truth to finally surface through recently declassified military documents and personal journals found in a forgotten Kansas farmhouse attic. The discovery that would eventually expose one of the most systematic disappearances in American railroad history began with the seemingly routine construction of the Kansas Western Railway during the height of the Civil War. The ambitious project aimed to connect the agricultural heartland of Kansas with the growing network of rails that would eventually span the entire continent, bringing prosperity and progress to the endless prairie that stretched beyond every horizon. Cedar Ridge emerged from the Kansas wilderness in early 1863 when railroad surveyor Thomas Mitchell identified the location as the perfect halfway point between the established depot town of Millfield and the planned terminus at Riverside Junction. The site offered everything necessary for a thriving railroad community: abundant fresh water from the nearby Cottonwood Creek, elevated ground that provided natural drainage during the frequent prairie storms, proximity to limestone quarries needed for track foundations, and vast grasslands that could support the horses and livestock essential to frontier life. Within months of Mitchell's initial survey, what began as a collection of canvas tents and hastily constructed wooden shanties transformed into a bustling railroad town of nearly 2,000 residents. The community attracted workers from across the war-torn nation, including Irish immigrants fleeing poverty and discrimination, German settlers seeking opportunities in the expanding West, freed slaves escaping the violence of Reconstruction, Confederate deserters looking for fresh starts away from the devastation of the South, and Union veterans who had decided to remain in Kansas rather than return to uncertain futures in their home states. The Kansas Western Railway represented more than simple transportation infrastructure during those turbulent years of national conflict. The railroad served crucial strategic purposes for the Union war effort, facilitating the movement of troops and supplies westward while also supporting the agricultural production that fed both civilian populations and military forces throughout the region. Federal funding and oversight ensured rapid construction progress, but the remote prairie location and urgent timeline created working conditions that prioritized speed over safety or careful supervision of the diverse workforce. Cedar Ridge developed its own unique character that reflected the chaotic nature of wartime construction projects. Main Street stretched nearly half a mile through the heart of the settlement, lined with businesses that served the practical needs of railroad workers and their families. Johnson's General Store, operated by former Pennsylvania merchant William Johnson and his wife Martha, functioned as the unofficial town center where news, supplies, and gossip circulated with equal intensity among residents who came from dozens of different states and several foreign countries. The Prairie Rose Hotel, a substantial three-story building constructed by entrepreneur James Sullivan, provided the only respectable accommodations for the steady stream of railroad officials, government inspectors, and traveling businessmen who visited Cedar Ridge to monitor construction progress or establish commercial relationships with the growing community. Sullivan had invested heavily in creating an establishment that could compete with hotels in more established cities, importing furniture from Chicago, hiring experienced staff from Kansas City, and maintaining standards of service that impressed visitors accustomed to urban amenities. The railroad work itself followed patterns established throughout the expanding American rail network, But the Kansas prairie presented unique challenges that tested the endurance and ingenuity of even the most experienced construction crews. Teams of workers labored in carefully coordinated shifts to grade roadbeds across the rolling grassland, blast through limestone outcroppings that blocked the surveyed route, construct wooden trestle bridges over creeks and ravines, and lay thousands of tons of steel rails with mathematical precision that would allow trains to travel safely at unprecedented speeds. The workforce demographics created a complex social environment that reflected the broader tensions and opportunities of Civil War-era America. Railroad construction attracted men from every social class and geographic region, creating temporary communities where former slaves worked alongside Confederate veterans. Irish immigrants collaborated with German craftsmen, and Union Army deserters found common cause with men fleeing various forms of trouble in distant states. Into this dynamic and often volatile environment came the Blackwood brothers in the late summer of 1863, arriving on a supply wagon from Independence during the first week of September, when the prairie grass had turned golden and the air carried the first hints of the brutal winter that lay ahead. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The four brothers, Robert aged 35, Charles aged 32, Henry aged 29, and Daniel aged 26, presented themselves as experienced railroad contractors with letters of recommendation from completed projects in Missouri and Illinois, though careful examination of their credentials would later reveal significant gaps and inconsistencies in their claimed work history. Robert Blackwood, the eldest and obvious leader of the group, possessed the commanding presence and technical knowledge necessary to manage complex construction projects involving hundreds of workers and thousands of tons of materials. Standing well over 6 feet tall, with the broad shoulders and calloused hands of someone accustomed to physical labor, he commanded immediate respect from both workers and supervisors, who valued competence over social refinement in the demanding environment of frontier railroad construction. His brothers each brought specialized skills that made their family operation particularly valuable to the Kansas Western Railway project. Charles handled financial arrangements and supply contracts with the methodical attention to detail that kept complex projects on schedule and within budget. Henry supervised the actual construction crews, coordinating the dangerous work of blasting, grading, and track laying that required constant vigilance to prevent accidents that could kill or maim workers while also delaying progress toward completion deadlines. Daniel, despite being the youngest, possessed exceptional skills in managing the diverse workforce that included men who spoke different languages, followed different customs, and often harbored mutual suspicions based on their varied backgrounds and previous experiences. His ability to communicate effectively with Irish immigrants, German craftsmen, freed slaves, and former Confederate soldiers made him invaluable in maintaining the cooperation necessary for successful completion of complex group projects. The Blackwood brothers established their base of operations in a large compound on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge that included workshops, storage facilities, and barrack-style housing for the specialized workers they brought to supplement the regular railroad construction crews. The compound, constructed with unusual attention to security and privacy, featured high wooden fences, limited access points, and guards who claimed to be protecting valuable equipment and supplies from theft by transient workers who might be tempted to supplement their modest wages through unauthorized acquisition of company property. Within weeks of their arrival, the Blackwood operation had integrated seamlessly into the broader railroad construction project, taking responsibility for some of the most challenging and dangerous aspects of track laying across the Kansas prairie. Their crews specialized in the hazardous work of blasting through rock formations, constructing bridges over water obstacles, and laying track across unstable ground conditions that required specialized knowledge and equipment to complete safely. and efficiently. The brothers quickly developed a reputation for accepting the most difficult assignments that other contractors avoided due to technical challenges, safety concerns, or tight completion deadlines. Their willingness to work in dangerous conditions for competitive prices made them popular with railroad supervisors who faced constant pressure from company officials and government overseers to maintain construction schedules despite weather delays, supply shortages, and workforce shortages that plagued frontier construction projects. The first disappearance occurred during the third week of October 1863, when the Kansas prairie experienced an early blizzard that dropped temperatures below freezing and covered the landscape with several inches of snow that made normal construction work impossible for several days. Michael O'Brien, a 23-year-old Irish immigrant who had been working as a track layer since arriving in Cedar Ridge during the previous month, failed to return to his boarding house after completing a night shift with one of the Blackwood specialized crews. O'Brien's background exemplified the circumstances that made certain workers particularly vulnerable to exploitation or violence on the frontier railroad projects. He had arrived in America only 6 months earlier, fleeing the poverty and limited opportunities that characterized rural Ireland during the mid-19th century. Carrying little more than the clothes on his back and a letter of introduction from a distant cousin, who had supposedly found success working on railroad construction in the American West, his limited English skills and unfamiliarity with American customs made him dependent on other Irish workers for guidance and protection in navigating the complex social environment of frontier construction camps where tensions between different ethnic groups sometimes erupted into violence. His lack of family connections or established relationships in Cedar Ridge meant that his disappearance initially attracted little attention from supervisors or fellow workers, who assumed he had simply moved on to seek better opportunities elsewhere. The official explanation provided by the Blackwood brothers suggested that O'Brien had expressed dissatisfaction with working conditions and had decided to travel to Colorado, where he had heard that mining operations offered higher wages and more comfortable living arrangements than railroad construction. They produced a hastily written note allegedly in O'Brien's handwriting expressing gratitude for the opportunity to work with their crew, but explaining his decision to pursue better prospects in the mining camps around Denver. However, several aspects of this explanation troubled O'Brien's few close friends among the Irish workers, particularly Patrick Murphy and Sean Kelly, who had worked alongside him since his arrival in Cedar Ridge and had never heard him express any interest in mining or any dissatisfaction with his current employment. They noted that O'Brien had recently received letters from family members in Ireland and had been eagerly planning to send money home to help his parents and younger siblings, making it unlikely that he would abandon steady employment for uncertain prospects in an unfamiliar industry. More suspicious was the fact that O'Brien had left behind his most valuable possessions, including his winter coat, work boots, and the small amount of savings he had accumulated during his weeks of employment. These items represented significant investments for someone with O'Brien's limited resources, and his friends could not understand why he would abandon them if he were truly departing for better opportunities elsewhere. The second disappearance followed a similar pattern just 2 weeks later, when German craftsman Friedrich Weber vanished during another night shift with the Blackwood crew. Weber, a skilled carpenter who specialized in constructing the wooden trestle bridges that carried railroad tracks over streams and ravines, had developed a reputation for exceptional workmanship and reliability that made him valuable to any construction project requiring precision woodworking. Unlike O'Brien, Weber possessed strong English language skills, maintained regular correspondence with family members in Missouri, and had accumulated sufficient savings to suggest that he was planning to establish permanent roots in Kansas rather than moving frequently in search of better opportunities. His disappearance during a routine bridge construction project raised immediate questions among his fellow German workers, who noted that he had recently purchased tools and materials for a woodworking shop he planned to establish in Cedar Ridge. After completing his railroad contract, the pattern continued throughout the winter months as workers continued to vanish during shifts with the Blackwood crews, always during overnight projects that took place away from the main construction camps where other workers might observe suspicious activities. By spring of 1864, at least 15 men had disappeared under circumstances that shared troubling similarities, though the chaotic nature of frontier construction work and the transient character of much of the workforce made it difficult to establish precise numbers or identify clear patterns. The missing workers represented a cross-section of the diverse railroad construction workforce, including Irish immigrants seeking better lives in America, German craftsmen with specialized skills, freed slaves escaping the violence of Reconstruction, Union Army veterans looking for steady employment, and Confederate deserters trying to build new identities far from the battlefields of the Civil War. This diversity initially worked to the advantage of whoever was responsible for the disappearances, as the different groups rarely communicated extensively with each other and might not immediately notice when members of other communities failed to appear for work. Railroad supervisor Thomas Mitchell, who had originally surveyed the Cedar Ridge location, began to notice the pattern of disappearances during early 1864 when he reviewed employment records and realized that turnover rates among workers assigned to Blackwood projects significantly exceeded normal expectations for frontier construction work. His investigation revealed that nearly 20% of workers assigned to Blackwood crews had left their employment without providing notice or collecting final wages, a rate that seemed implausible even considering the transient nature of railroad construction work. Mitchell's concerns intensified when he attempted to verify the departure explanations provided by the Blackwood brothers and discovered that none of the supposedly departed workers had appeared at other railroad projects in the region, had contacted family members to announce their new employment, or had been observed in nearby towns where transient workers typically sought temporary shelter while traveling between job sites. His unofficial investigation led him to interview workers who had previously been assigned to Blackwood crews but had requested transfers to other projects, ostensibly for personal reasons or to gain experience with different types of construction work. These conversations revealed a consistent pattern of unease and suspicion regarding the Blackwood operations, though most workers were reluctant to make specific accusations that might jeopardize their employment or create conflicts with powerful contractors. Several workers mentioned the unusual security measures employed at the Blackwood compound, including armed guards who prevented unauthorized access to storage areas and living quarters, restrictions on communication between Blackwood workers and other railroad employees, and requirements that workers assigned to certain projects sign confidentiality agreements that prohibited them from discussing their activities with anyone outside the organization. More troubling were reports of strange sounds and activities observed during nighttime hours at the Blackwood compound, including what appeared to be excavation work that continued well past normal construction hours, the movement of wagons and equipment during times when no legitimate construction activities were scheduled, and the presence of individuals who did not appear to be railroad workers, but who seemed to have ongoing business relationships with the Blackwood brothers. The investigation that would eventually expose the truth behind the disappearances began in earnest during May 1864, when Mitchell's growing suspicions led him to contact federal authorities responsible for overseeing the Kansas Western Railway project. His detailed report to Colonel Harrison Wheeler, the military officer assigned to coordinate railroad construction with Union Army logistics requirements, provided the first comprehensive documentation of the suspicious patterns that had developed around the Blackwood operation. Colonel Wheeler, a career military officer with extensive experience investigating supply theft and other crimes that plagued military construction projects, recognized immediately that Mitchell's concerns warranted serious investigation by experienced federal agents rather than local authorities who might be compromised by personal relationships or financial interests. His decision to involve federal resources in investigating the disappearances reflected both the strategic importance of railroad construction to the Union war effort and the growing recognition that frontier construction projects created opportunities for systematic criminal activity that required professional law enforcement attention. The federal investigation team that arrived in Cedar Ridge during the first week of June 1864 included experienced agents from the newly formed Secret Service, military investigators familiar with wartime fraud and theft, and civilian specialists in railroad construction who could evaluate the technical aspects of the Blackwood operation. The size and expertise of the investigative team reflected federal recognition that the disappearances might represent more than simple labor disputes or individual criminal acts, potentially involving systematic fraud, theft, or violence that threatened the security of critical wartime infrastructure. The investigation quickly revealed that the Blackwood brothers had been operating a sophisticated criminal enterprise that exploited the chaotic conditions of wartime railroad construction to systematically murder workers and steal their wages, savings, and personal property. The remote prairie location, diverse workforce, and urgent construction deadlines had created perfect conditions for predators who understood how to manipulate social divisions and institutional weaknesses to avoid detection while accumulating substantial profits from their crimes. The federal agents discovered that the Blackwood compound served multiple purposes that extended far beyond legitimate railroad construction activities. What appeared to be a standard contractor operation actually functioned as the headquarters for a criminal network that stretched across several states and involved dozens of accomplices who facilitated various aspects of their systematic theft and murder enterprise. The compound's unusual layout and security measures, which the brothers had explained as necessary protection for valuable equipment and supplies, actually served to conceal evidence of their crimes while providing secure facilities for processing stolen property and disposing of victims' remains. The high wooden fences and restricted access points that supposedly protected against theft by transient workers actually prevented outside observers from witnessing the activities that took place during nighttime hours when the brothers conducted their most sensitive operations. Federal investigators mapped the compound's buildings and discovered several structures that served no apparent, legitimate purpose in railroad construction work. A large warehouse that the brothers claimed contained specialized equipment and materials actually housed an extensive collection of personal belongings taken from their victims, sorted and cataloged like merchandise awaiting shipment to distant markets where their origins would not be questioned by potential buyers. Adjacent to the warehouse stood a building that the brothers described as a workshop for repairing tools and equipment, but investigation revealed that it contained facilities for melting down gold and silver jewelry, altering identification marks on valuable items, and creating false documentation that could be used to establish fraudulent ownership of stolen property. The sophistication of these facilities suggested that the brothers had been planning and refining their criminal operation for considerably longer than their official presence in Cedar Ridge would indicate. Most disturbing was the discovery of what the brothers had described as a root cellar for storing food supplies during the harsh Kansas winters. The underground facility extended far beyond what would be necessary for food storage, featuring multiple chambers connected by narrow tunnels that provided secure locations for imprisoning victims before their murder and for storing bodies until they could be disposed of in remote prairie locations where discovery would be unlikely. The investigation revealed that the brothers had modified the natural limestone caves that existed beneath much of the Cedar Ridge area, expanding them through systematic excavation that created an underground complex capable of accommodating their criminal activities while remaining completely hidden from surface observation. The extensive modifications required significant time, labor, and expertise, indicating that their criminal planning had begun long before their arrival in Cedar Ridge and involved accomplices with specialized knowledge of construction and excavation techniques. Colonel Wheeler's team discovered that the Blackwood brothers maintained detailed records of their criminal activities with the same methodical attention to business practices that characterized legitimate commercial enterprises. Hidden throughout the compound in various concealed locations, these records documented each victim's personal information, the circumstances of their disappearance, the value of property stolen from them, and the methods used to dispose of evidence and create plausible explanations for their absence. The accounting system revealed the systematic nature of their operation and the careful planning that enabled them to continue their crimes for nearly a year without detection by railroad supervisors or law enforcement authorities. Each victim had been selected based on specific criteria designed to minimize the risk of investigation while maximizing the potential profit from their murder, including their lack of local family connections, limited English language skills that made communication with authorities difficult, possession of savings or valuable property worth stealing, and personal circumstances that made sudden departures seem plausible to coworkers and supervisors. The records also documented the brothers' methods for creating believable explanations for workers' departures, including forged letters allegedly written by victims announcing their decisions to seek better opportunities elsewhere, fabricated job offers from railroad projects in distant states, and invented personal emergencies that supposedly required workers to return to their home communities. The sophistication of these deceptions demonstrated considerable understanding of human psychology and the social dynamics that governed frontier construction communities. Federal agents discovered that the brothers had established relationships with criminal associates in multiple states who assisted various aspects of their operation, including fences who specialized in disposing of stolen property in distant markets, document forgers who provided false papers for various fraudulent schemes, and transportation networks that moved stolen goods along established criminal routes that connected frontier communities with urban markets where valuable items could be sold without attracting unwanted attention from authorities. This criminal network enabled the Blackwood operation to function with a level of sophistication that would have been impossible for four isolated individuals operating in a remote prairie location. Their associates provided access to information about railroad construction projects throughout the region, enabling them to identify other locations where similar operations might be established, and offered resources for disposing of evidence and creating plausible cover stories that could withstand casual investigation by local authorities. The investigation also revealed that the brothers had been systematically corrupting local officials who might otherwise have investigated the pattern of disappearances or questioned inconsistencies in their explanations for departed workers. Cedar Ridge Sheriff Benjamin Hayes, Thomas Mitchell had discovered, received regular payments that far exceeded his official salary, along with expensive gifts and other considerations that ensured his cooperation in dismissing concerns about missing workers as the natural result of frontier labor mobility. Hayes had been provided with detailed explanations for each disappearance that he could repeat to anyone who inquired about missing workers, and he had been instructed to characterize such inquiries as unreasonable expectations that failed to account for the realities of frontier construction work where men frequently moved between projects in search of better opportunities or working conditions. His willingness to accept these explanations without investigation had been crucial to the brothers' ability to continue their operation without triggering serious law enforcement attention. The corruption extended beyond local law enforcement to include railroad supervisors, supply contractors, and other individuals whose cooperation or silence was necessary for the brothers to maintain their legitimate business facade while conducting their criminal activities. The systematic nature of this corruption demonstrated the brothers' understanding that successful long-term criminal enterprises required the neutralization of potential threats through financial incentives, personal relationships, or other forms of influence that could prevent unwanted scrutiny. Colonel Wheeler's investigation team discovered evidence that the Blackwood brothers had been expanding their criminal activities beyond simple murder and theft to include various forms of fraud and extortion that exploited the chaotic conditions of wartime railroad construction. They had been submitting false invoices for work never performed, claiming reimbursement for materials never purchased, and billing for workers who existed only on paper, generating substantial additional income that supplemented the profits from their systematic murder of actual employees. The brothers had also developed blackmail schemes targeting railroad officials and government contractors, whose own irregularities in managing construction projects made them vulnerable to exposure if they became too curious about Blackwood operations. Their detailed knowledge of widespread corruption and mismanagement in frontier construction projects provided them with leverage over individuals who might otherwise have investigated suspicious patterns or questioned their business practices. Federal agents found extensive correspondence between the brothers and criminal associates throughout the Western Territories, revealing plans to establish similar operations in other railroad construction communities where conditions might be favorable for systematic predation on transient workers. These documents indicated that the Cedar Ridge operation was intended as a prototype for a much larger criminal enterprise that could exploit the massive infrastructure development occurring throughout the American West during the post-Civil War period. The scope of their ambitions became clear through detailed business plans that treated murder and theft as scalable commercial activities, complete with projected revenues, estimated costs, and strategic assessments of market opportunities. In different geographic regions, the brothers had conducted systematic research into railroad construction schedules, worker demographics, and law enforcement capabilities in communities throughout Kansas, Colorado, Nebraska, and other territories where similar operations might prove profitable. Investigation of the brothers' backgrounds revealed that their claimed experience in railroad construction was largely fabricated, and their true identities remained unclear even after extensive investigation by federal agents with access to military and civilian records throughout the United States. The letters of recommendation they had presented upon arriving in Cedar Ridge proved to be forgeries, and the previous construction projects they claimed to have completed either never existed or had no record of employing anyone matching their descriptions. This discovery suggested that the Blackwood brothers might not even be their real names, and that their operation in Cedar Ridge represented just one phase of a criminal career that could have extended across multiple states and involved additional victims whose deaths had never been properly investigated. The systematic destruction of evidence and the sophisticated methods used to create false identities made it impossible for federal investigators to determine the full extent of their previous criminal activities. The investigation revealed that the brothers had been preparing to abandon their Cedar Ridge operation and relocate to a new community, where they could establish similar criminal enterprises under different identities. They had been gradually liquidating their accumulated stolen property, converting valuable items into cash and gold that could be easily transported, and developing new false credentials that would enable them to present themselves as experienced contractors in communities where their criminal history would be unknown. Their long-term planning included detailed assessments of railroad construction projects throughout the Western Territories, identification of communities where working conditions and law enforcement capabilities might favor their criminal activities, and establishment of relationships with criminal associates who could provide support services in new locations. The sophistication of their planning demonstrated that they viewed their criminal enterprise as a sustainable business model that could be replicated indefinitely as long as they remained ahead of law enforcement attention. The systematic elimination of railroad workers reached its peak during the brutal winter months of 1864. when harsh weather conditions provided perfect cover for the brothers' most audacious crimes. The Kansas prairie experienced one of its most severe winters on record, with temperatures plunging well below zero for weeks at a time and blizzards that isolated Cedar Ridge from the outside world for days at a stretch. These conditions created opportunities for the brothers to accelerate their operations while minimizing the risk of detection by outside authorities or unexpected visitors who might observe suspicious activities. During this period, the brothers refined their victim selection process to focus specifically on workers who possessed the greatest vulnerability and the least likelihood of being missed immediately. They targeted recent immigrants who had not yet established strong social connections within the community, men recovering from injuries or illnesses that made them dependent on others for basic needs, and individuals who had accumulated substantial savings that made their elimination particularly profitable for the criminal enterprise. The methods used to lure victims to their deaths became increasingly sophisticated as the brothers learned from each successful crime and identified ways to reduce risk while increasing efficiency. Rather than relying on random opportunities or chance encounters, they began systematically manipulating work assignments to ensure that selected victims would be isolated from other workers during vulnerable periods when rescue or intervention would be impossible. Henry Blackwood proved particularly skilled at creating seemingly legitimate reasons for workers to travel alone to remote locations, where they could be eliminated without witnesses or evidence that might lead back to the brothers' operation. His authority as a construction supervisor enabled him to assign workers to special projects that supposedly required expertise or reliability that made them ideal candidates for important but dangerous assignments away from the main construction sites. These assignments typically involved urgent repairs to rail infrastructure that had supposedly been damaged by severe weather, inspection of construction materials stored in remote locations, or delivery of important messages to other construction crews working on distant sections of the railroad line. The plausible nature of these assignments ensured that victims would depart willingly, and that their absence would not immediately raise suspicions among co-workers who assumed they were performing legitimate railroad duties. The brothers had also developed elaborate systems for creating false evidence that would support their explanations for workers' disappearances long after the crimes had been committed. They maintained collections of personal items taken from previous victims that could be planted at locations throughout the region to suggest that missing workers had traveled to distant communities in search of better employment opportunities, or had fallen victim to common frontier dangers like severe weather or wild animal attacks. Daniel Blackwood specialized in forging letters and documents that could be used to create believable narratives about departed workers' activities and intentions. His skills included reproducing individual handwriting styles with remarkable accuracy, creating aged paper and ink that would appear authentic under casual examination, and composing messages that reflected the vocabulary, grammar, and personal concerns that would be expected from specific individuals based on their educational backgrounds and personal circumstances. These forged documents served multiple purposes in the brothers' criminal operation, providing immediate explanations for workers' absences that would satisfy supervisors and co-workers, creating false trails that would mislead any potential investigations, and establishing fictional destinations that would make recovery efforts more difficult and expensive for families or authorities who might attempt to locate missing individuals. The brothers had established a network of accomplices who could provide corroborating evidence for their fabricated stories about departed workers. These associates, located in communities throughout Kansas and neighboring states, would produce witnesses who claimed to have seen missing workers passing through their towns, merchants who supposedly sold supplies to travelers matching victims' descriptions, and officials who could verify that specific individuals had inquired about employment opportunities or transportation to distant locations. This network enabled the brothers to create comprehensive fictional narratives that could withstand detailed investigation by experienced law enforcement officers or persistent family members who refused to accept simple explanations for their loved ones' disappearances. The coordination required to maintain these elaborate deceptions demonstrated the systematic planning and resources that the brothers had invested in ensuring the long-term success of their criminal enterprise. The physical evidence of their crimes accumulated throughout the compound and surrounding prairie locations where they disposed of victims remains using methods designed to prevent identification and minimize the likelihood of accidental discovery. The brothers had studied the effects of Kansas weather patterns on organic materials and had selected burial sites that would maximize natural decomposition while ensuring that any remains discovered by accident would be too degraded to provide useful information to investigators. Their disposal methods included the use of lime and other chemicals to accelerate decomposition, burial in locations where seasonal flooding would disperse remains across wide areas, and placement of bodies in natural depressions or animal burrows where they would be more likely to be consumed by scavengers before discovery by human observers. The systematic nature of these disposal techniques indicated considerable research and experimentation to identify the most effective methods for eliminating physical evidence. The brothers also maintained detailed maps of burial locations and disposal sites throughout the region, enabling them to monitor these areas for signs of disturbance or discovery, while also providing information that could be used to relocate remains if changing conditions made specific sites too risky for continued use. This level of organization suggested that they viewed evidence disposal as a critical component of their operation that required the same careful planning and systematic execution as victim selection and elimination. Charles Blackwood had developed an extensive accounting system that tracked every aspect of their criminal enterprise with the precision of a legitimate business operation. His records documented not only the profits generated from each victim's murder, but also the costs associated with maintaining their operation, including bribes to corrupt officials, payments to criminal associates, expenses for equipment and supplies needed for disposal of evidence, and investments in expanding their network of accomplices and business relationships. The financial records revealed the enormous profitability of their systematic murder enterprise, with individual victims generating profits ranging from $50 to several $100, depending on their personal wealth and the value of property that could be stolen and sold through criminal networks. When multiplied across dozens of victims over nearly a year of continuous operation, these profits represented wealth that would have been virtually impossible to accumulate through legitimate means in frontier communities, where most workers earned less than $2 per day. The brothers had been converting much of their stolen wealth into gold and silver that could be easily transported and would retain value, regardless of economic conditions or geographic location. They maintained hidden caches of precious metals and valuable items throughout the region, providing them with resources that could support extended periods of criminal activity or enable them to establish new operations in distant communities where their criminal history would be unknown. Their wealth accumulation strategy also included investments in legitimate businesses and property that could provide long-term income and respectability once they decided to abandon their criminal activities. These investments were made under false names and through intermediaries who could provide plausible explanations for the sources of their capital, creating the foundation for future lives as respected businessmen and community leaders in locations where their criminal past would never be suspected. The psychological impact of their systematic crimes extended beyond the immediate victims to affect the entire Cedar Ridge community, though most residents remained unaware of the true source of their growing unease and suspicion. Workers began to avoid assignments that required travel to remote locations. Families became reluctant to allow their members to work night shifts or special projects, and an atmosphere of fear and mistrust gradually permeated the previously optimistic railroad construction community. The brothers skillfully exploited these psychological effects to further their criminal objectives, using the general atmosphere of fear and uncertainty to justify additional security measures that actually served to conceal their activities, while making workers more dependent on their protection and guidance. They positioned themselves as concerned supervisors who understood the legitimate dangers of frontier construction work and could provide safety and security that other contractors might not offer to their employees. This manipulation enabled them to maintain the loyalty and cooperation of workers who might otherwise have become suspicious of the unusual patterns and requirements associated with Blackwood projects. By presenting themselves as protectors rather than predators, they ensured that potential victims would willingly place themselves in vulnerable positions, while also discouraging other workers from asking questions or investigating activities that seemed unusual or suspicious. The brothers had also begun to diversify their criminal activities to include systematic theft of railroad construction materials, fraudulent billing for work never performed, and extortion schemes targeting other contractors who depended on their cooperation for successful completion of construction projects. These additional criminal enterprises provided supplementary income while also creating leverage over potential witnesses or competitors who might threaten their primary murder and theft operation. The expansion of their criminal activities required additional accomplices and more sophisticated coordination between different aspects of their operation. They recruited local residents who could provide information about potential victims, transportation services for moving stolen property, and storage facilities for materials that could not be immediately sold through their established criminal networks. This expansion increased their profits, but also created additional risks as more people became aware of at least some aspects of their criminal activities. By early spring of 1864, the Blackwood brothers had eliminated 34 railroad workers through systematic murder while accumulating wealth that would have supported comfortable lives for decades. Their success had exceeded their original expectations and had demonstrated the viability of their criminal model for replication in other communities throughout the expanding American West. However, their very success would ultimately prove to be their downfall as the scale of their crimes became too large to conceal indefinitely from experienced federal investigators who possessed the resources and authority necessary to conduct comprehensive investigations. The Blackwood brothers' systematic elimination of railroad workers might have continued indefinitely had they not made a critical error in selecting their next victim during the first week of March 1864. Their target was James Morrison, a 30-year-old Scottish engineer who had arrived in Cedar Ridge with impeccable credentials from railroad projects throughout the eastern United States and possessed connections to influential businessmen and government officials who would immediately notice his disappearance and demand thorough investigations. Morrison represented everything the brothers had learned to avoid in their careful victim selection process. He came from a prominent family in Philadelphia with extensive business interests and political connections, maintained regular correspondence with relatives and professional associates throughout the country, possessed advanced technical education that made him valuable to railroad construction projects, and had accumulated sufficient wealth and reputation to ensure that his sudden disappearance would trigger immediate and comprehensive search efforts by people with the resources and influence to demand answers from federal authorities. His presence in Cedar Ridge resulted from a special assignment from Union Pacific executives who had specifically requested his expertise in evaluating construction techniques and identifying potential improvements that could accelerate completion of the Kansas Western Railway. His mission involved detailed inspection of all contractor operations, including comprehensive reviews of their methods, workforce management, and financial practices that would bring him into direct contact with every aspect of the Blackwood enterprise. Morrison's educational background included advanced training in engineering and construction management from prestigious institutions in Scotland and Pennsylvania, giving him the technical knowledge necessary to recognize irregularities or inefficiencies that might escape the attention of less educated supervisors. His experience with major railroad projects throughout the Eastern United States had exposed him to various forms of fraud and corruption, making him naturally suspicious of operations that seemed to deviate from established industry standards or best practices. Within days of his arrival, Morrison began to notice patterns and inconsistencies that suggested serious problems with the Blackwood operation. His systematic approach to evaluating construction techniques revealed that their methods, while producing acceptable results, involved unnecessarily dangerous procedures that resulted in unusually high rates of worker injuries and equipment damage. More troubling was his discovery that their workforce turnover rates exceeded normal expectations even for frontier construction projects known for their transient labor forces. Morrison's investigation techniques, developed through years of experience identifying fraud and mismanagement in complex construction projects, enabled him to detect subtle signs of deception that would have been invisible to casual observers. His analysis of employment records revealed discrepancies between the number of workers supposedly hired and the actual workforce present at any given time, inconsistencies in wage payments that suggested systematic theft of worker compensation, and patterns of departure that seemed statistically impossible under normal circumstances. His professional obligations required him to document these concerns in detailed reports to Union Pacific executives and federal oversight officials, creating written records that would survive even if Morrison himself were eliminated. The brothers discovered that Morrison had been preparing comprehensive documentation of their operation, including detailed financial analysis, workforce statistics, and observations about suspicious activities that could provide federal investigators with the information necessary to expose their criminal enterprise. The brothers faced an unprecedented dilemma in deciding how to handle Morrison's investigation. Their usual methods of elimination would be completely inappropriate for someone with his background and connections, as his disappearance would immediately trigger federal investigations that could expose their entire operation. However, allowing him to complete his evaluation and submit his reports would certainly result in comprehensive investigations that would discover their systematic murder of railroad workers and lead to their arrest and execution. Robert Blackwood, whose leadership had been crucial to their success, began to show signs of the psychological pressure created by their increasingly precarious situation. His decision-making became erratic and defensive, leading him to propose increasingly desperate measures that revealed his growing panic about the threats posed by Morrison's investigation. His discussions with his brothers about potential solutions included suggestions for eliminating Morrison despite the obvious risks, attempting to bribe or intimidate him into modifying his reports, or abandoning their Cedar Ridge operation immediately to avoid exposure. Charles Blackwood, whose financial management had enabled their systematic accumulation of stolen wealth, argued for immediate departure from Cedar Ridge with whatever assets they could quickly liquidate and transport. His analysis of their financial position indicated that they had accumulated sufficient wealth to support comfortable lives in distant locations where their criminal history would be unknown, making continued operation in Cedar Ridge an unnecessary risk that could result in the loss of everything they had gained through nearly a year of systematic murder. Henry and Daniel Blackwood, whose specialized skills in workforce management and deception had been essential to their operation, disagreed about the best approach to their crisis. Henry favored aggressive action to eliminate Morrison and anyone else who might threaten their operation, arguing that their systematic methods could be adapted to handle even high-profile targets if they planned carefully and executed flawlessly. Daniel preferred more subtle approaches that might discredit Morrison's credibility or create alternative explanations for his concerns that would deflect serious investigation. Their debates about how to handle the Morrison threat revealed fundamental disagreements about risk management and long-term strategy that had been concealed by their previous success. The stress of facing exposure for the first time in their criminal careers exposed personality conflicts and strategic differences that threatened to undermine the cooperation that had made their systematic murder enterprise so successful. Morrison's investigation continued despite the brothers' growing desperation, and his findings became increasingly damaging as he uncovered additional evidence of their criminal activities. His engineering expertise enabled him to recognize that modifications to the compound buildings served no legitimate construction purposes and were more likely designed to conceal illegal activities. His financial analysis revealed patterns of expense and revenue that could not be explained by legitimate railroad construction work, suggesting systematic theft or other criminal enterprises. Most damaging was Morrison's discovery of personal items belonging to supposedly departed workers hidden throughout the compound in locations where they would not normally be stored if the workers had actually left voluntarily for other employment. His systematic search of the facilities, conducted under the authority of his federal inspection assignment, revealed collections of clothing, tools, personal letters, and valuable items that represented far more individuals than could be accounted for by the normal turnover of workers in legitimate construction operations. Morrison's Scottish background had exposed him to criminal investigation techniques used by police authorities in Edinburgh and Glasgow, giving him practical knowledge of evidence collection and documentation that enabled him to build comprehensive cases against suspected criminals. His methodical approach to gathering proof of the brothers' crimes included detailed photographs, precise measurements, careful documentation of the locations where evidence was discovered, and systematic recording of witness statements from workers who had observed suspicious activities. His correspondence with Union Pacific executives and federal authorities, discovered by the brothers when they attempted to intercept his mail, revealed that he had already transmitted preliminary reports describing his concerns and requesting immediate federal investigation of the Blackwood operation. These communications indicated that Morrison's elimination would no longer prevent exposure of their crimes, as his initial findings had already reached officials with the authority and resources to conduct comprehensive investigations, regardless of what happened to Morrison personally. The brothers' attempts to monitor Morrison's activities revealed the extent to which their criminal enterprise had compromised their judgment and decision-making capabilities. Their desperation led them to take increasingly obvious risks in surveillance and intimidation that actually provided Morrison with additional evidence of their criminal intent while failing to prevent his continued investigation of their activities. Daniel Blackwood made the fatal error of attempting to search Morrison's personal quarters while the engineer was conducting field inspections, hoping to discover and destroy documentation that might expose their crimes. Morrison had anticipated such attempts and had prepared his room with simple but effective detection methods that would reveal unauthorized entry, while also protecting his most important documents through secure storage and backup copies maintained in multiple locations. Morrison's discovery that his quarters had been searched provided him with definitive proof that the Blackwood brothers were attempting to obstruct his investigation, transforming his professional concerns about construction irregularities into criminal allegations that would require immediate federal intervention. His subsequent reports to federal authorities explicitly identified the brothers as suspects in systematic fraud and possibly more serious crimes that warranted comprehensive investigation by experienced federal agents. The brothers' situation deteriorated rapidly as Morrison's reports triggered the federal response they had desperately hoped to avoid. Colonel Harrison Wheeler's decision to dispatch a comprehensive investigation team to Cedar Ridge reflected federal recognition that Morrison's allegations, combined with his professional credentials and documented evidence, warranted immediate attention from experienced law enforcement officers with the authority and resources necessary to conduct thorough criminal investigations. The arrival of federal agents in Cedar Ridge during the second week of June 1864 caught the brothers completely unprepared, despite Morrison's warnings that federal investigation was imminent. Their criminal success had created a false sense of security that prevented them from developing adequate contingency plans for dealing with professional law enforcement attention, leaving them vulnerable to systematic investigation by agents trained in techniques specifically designed to expose complex criminal enterprises. Federal agents immediately recognized that the Blackwood operation exhibited characteristics typical of systematic criminal enterprises, including elaborate security measures that exceeded legitimate business requirements, financial irregularities that suggested systematic theft or fraud, and behavioral patterns among the brothers that indicated consciousness of guilt and attempts to conceal criminal activities. Their professional experience with similar cases enabled them to identify promising avenues for investigation while avoiding the mistakes that had enabled the brothers to deceive local authorities for nearly a year. The federal investigation began with comprehensive interviews of current and former Blackwood employees, revealing consistent patterns of suspicious activities, unexplained disappearances, and intimidation tactics that had prevented workers from reporting their concerns to authorities. These interviews provided investigators with detailed information about the brothers' methods while also identifying potential witnesses who could provide testimony about specific crimes and criminal activities. Agent Samuel Garrett, the lead federal investigator assigned to the case, possessed extensive experience with complex criminal investigations throughout the Western Territories and immediately recognized the systematic nature of the Blackwood operation. His analysis of the available evidence indicated that the brothers' crimes extended far beyond simple fraud or theft to include systematic violence against workers who posed threats to their operation or possessed valuable property that could be stolen through murder. Garrett's investigation team included specialists in forensic examination of physical evidence, financial analysis of complex criminal enterprises, and interrogation techniques designed to extract information from suspects who had been trained to resist conventional questioning methods. The comprehensive nature of their investigation reflected federal recognition that the Blackwood case might represent one of the most significant criminal enterprises discovered in the Western Territories. During the Civil War period, the systematic search of the Blackwood compound revealed evidence that exceeded even the investigators' expectations for the scope and brutality of the brothers' criminal activities. The underground facilities discovered beneath the compound contained physical evidence of systematic imprisonment, torture, and murder that had been conducted with businesslike efficiency over nearly a year of continuous operation. The forensic examination of these facilities revealed evidence of at least 34 separate murders, confirming Morrison's estimates about the scale of the brothers' criminal enterprise while also providing detailed information about their methods and the systematic nature of their approach to eliminating victims. The professional quality of the evidence collection and analysis ensured that the federal case against the brothers would be comprehensive and irrefutable. Agent Garrett's team also discovered the extensive records maintained by Charles Blackwood, providing detailed documentation of each murder, including victim identification, methods used, profits generated, and disposal of remains. These records, combined with the physical evidence discovered throughout the compound, created the most comprehensive documentation of systematic murder ever assembled in American criminal history to that point. The investigation revealed that the brothers had been preparing to abandon their Cedar Ridge operation and establish similar criminal enterprises in other communities throughout the Western Territories. Their long-term planning included detailed assessments of potential target communities, establishment of relationships with criminal associates who could provide support services, and accumulation of resources necessary to support extended periods of criminal activity in new locations. Morrison's intervention had prevented the brothers from escaping justice and establishing additional operations that could have resulted in hundreds of additional murders throughout the American West. His professional expertise and systematic approach to investigation had provided federal authorities with the information and evidence necessary to expose one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in American history, while also preventing its expansion to other communities where similar systematic predation might have continued for years without detection. The trial of Robert, Charles, Henry, and Daniel Blackwood commenced on September 3, 1864, in the federal courthouse in Kansas City, presided over by Judge Marcus Thompson, a distinguished jurist specifically appointed to handle the unprecedented complexity of the case. The proceedings attracted attention from newspapers throughout the United States, as the systematic nature of their crimes represented one of the most shocking criminal enterprises in American history. The evidence presented by federal prosecutors proved overwhelming in both scope and detail. Agent Samuel Garrett testified about the comprehensive investigation that had uncovered 34 confirmed murders, while forensic specialists presented physical evidence recovered from the underground chambers that confirmed the systematic torture and elimination of railroad workers over nearly 12 months of continuous operation. James Morrison's testimony provided crucial insight into the investigation that had exposed the brothers' criminal enterprise. His detailed documentation of financial irregularities, workforce inconsistencies, and suspicious activities had provided federal authorities with the framework necessary to understand the full scope of their systematic murder operation, while also preventing additional crimes through timely intervention. The brothers' own meticulously maintained records, discovered throughout their compound, provided prosecutors with unprecedented documentation of systematic murder treated as routine business transactions. Charles Blackwood's accounting ledgers detailed each victim's personal information, the methods used for their elimination, and the profits generated from stealing their wages and personal property. Dr. William Patterson, the federal medical examiner who conducted forensic analysis of remains recovered from burial sites throughout the prairie surrounding Cedar Ridge, testified about the systematic methods used to eliminate victims while minimizing evidence that could lead to detection. His analysis confirmed that the brothers had refined their killing techniques over time to maximize efficiency while reducing the risk of discovery. The defense attorneys appointed to represent the brothers faced the impossible task of defending clients whose guilt was established by comprehensive physical evidence, detailed written records of their crimes, and testimony from dozens of witnesses. Their attempts to argue that frontier conditions had driven the brothers to desperate measures found no sympathy with jurors who had heard extensive testimony about the calculated and systematic nature of the murders. After deliberating for less than 3 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts against all 4 brothers for multiple counts of murder, fraud, and conspiracy. Federal Judge Thompson sentenced each brother to death by hanging, making them the largest group of defendants to receive capital punishment for systematic murder in federal court history. The executions took place on November 18, 1864, before a crowd of nearly 3,000 spectators who had traveled from throughout the region to witness the end of one of the most systematic criminal enterprises in American history. Contemporary accounts described the brothers' final moments as reflecting their different personalities, with Robert maintaining defiant silence, Charles expressing remorse for their crimes, Henry attempting to justify their actions, and Daniel breaking down completely. The aftermath of the case brought significant changes to federal oversight of railroad construction projects throughout the Western Territories. New regulations required detailed documentation of worker employment and departure, regular inspections by federal agents, and comprehensive background investigations of contractors seeking government work. The Blackwood compound was demolished immediately after the executions, and the site remained vacant for decades as local residents considered it cursed by the horrific crimes that had occurred there. Cedar Ridge itself began declining as the railroad construction moved westward, and by 1870, the town had been largely abandoned. The case established important precedents for federal investigation of complex criminal enterprises and demonstrated the need for systematic oversight of frontier construction projects where vulnerable workers might be exploited by predators. The comprehensive documentation assembled during the investigation became a model for future criminal cases involving systematic murder and fraud. Modern criminologists studying the Blackwood case have identified it as one of the earliest examples of organized serial killing in American history, notable for its systematic approach and businesslike organization. The brothers' detailed records provide unprecedented insight into the psychology and methods of criminals who treated murder as a routine commercial activity. The 34 railroad workers who lost their lives to the Blackwood brothers' systematic greed represent more than statistics in criminal history. They were immigrants seeking better lives in America, veterans hoping to rebuild after the Civil War, and ordinary men whose dreams of prosperity on the frontier were cut short by predators who exploited their vulnerability and trust. Their story serves as a reminder that the most dangerous criminals often present themselves as respectable members of society, using positions of authority and trust to prey upon those who depend on them for safety and honest employment. The systematic nature of the Blackwood crimes demonstrates how quickly evil can flourish when oversight is inadequate and vulnerable. Populations lack protection from those who would exploit their desperation. The lessons learned from this case about protecting vulnerable workers and maintaining vigilant oversight of those in positions of authority remain relevant today, as modern society continues to grapple with the challenge of preventing systematic exploitation while promoting economic development and opportunity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.